Hi guys, hope everyone's well and welcome back to the Improvement Podcast. So in this episode today, I'm going to touch on what data you should track. So by data, I pretty much mean information. And there's a lot of value in tracking certain metrics when it comes to training, when it comes to nutrition and other areas regarding your fitness journey. And the reason being is what's measured is managed, meaning what we can measure, we can manage accordingly, we can kind of handle accordingly and make sure it's in a good spot. So if we're not kind of measuring certain things that can impact our fitness, then we're leaving our progression potentially up to chance. So that's why I recommend kind of making sure you're tracking the main kind of factors that are going to influence your progress, which we'll get to. So there's a few things we want to first of all consider when it comes to what should we track. And the main thing is it actionable? So the data you're tracking, can you actually do anything using that data? There's a lot of kind of smart devices and tools out there to track certain metrics that can impact your fitness, but can you actually do anything to adjust those metrics accordingly? Or are you willing to spend the time adjusting those metrics accordingly? That's something super important to be aware of, because if you're tracking metrics that you aren't actually going to use that data in a positive manner, then there's not really much point tracking it. And it can even be negative tracking certain variables, which we'll get to. But as well as that, is it worth the time and effort? So obviously there's a lot of things you can track, which we'll get to, but how much time do you want to spend committing to your fitness journey, and how much time can you realistically manage to track, or how much time can you realistically devote to your fitness and tracking certain variables? Because if, let's say, you're not wanting to maximise every single variable, you don't want to spend the time doing so, then you don't need to track all the wee minute details and variables that will impact your fitness. And you can also consider, is there any negative impacts or effects of tracking? For example, if someone was tracking their sleep and they seen that they slept poor, is that actually going to, see, tracking your sleep, of course it means you can see what's going to improve your sleep, not going to improve your sleep, see why maybe you didn't have a good session, help kind of troubleshoot why your training didn't go well, and be right, my sleep was poor, that will be why. But apart from that, you can, I got into habit of this, and I'm going to expand on this later, if I slept poor, looked at my sleep in the morning, that kind of stressed me out a bit and kind of frustrated me a touch, and just went on, today might not be a good session, and gave me preconceived ideas of how that session is going to go before I even stepped foot in the gym, which is obviously not going to be positive at all. And if it's causing stress when it comes to knowing I've had a bad sleep and I'm getting stressed out about that, that's just going to make things even worse. So do you have a reason to track the variables you're thinking about tracking, which I'll get to. I'm going to talk through what variables I recommend tracking, what variables I don't, and why. And there's ways of progressing without tracking in much variables at all, really. And the reason being is, for example, nutrition. You don't need to track your calories if you don't want to. It's going to mean there's more room for error when it comes to your nutrition. What I mean by that is you might not be as likely to lose weight if you're not tracking, because if you're tracking, you're weighing everything out, then you're definitely you're most likely going to lose weight. Obviously your body can adapt and then put yourself at maintenance, but if you eat 2,000 calories, you need 2,500 to maintain weight. It's you can't really argue you're going to lose weight if you keep everything consistent, expenditure, training, etc. So that's the benefit of obviously tracking, but you can do so without. For example, how did people lose weight before MyFitnessPal was a thing? And how do people still lose weight today? Maybe people, older individuals, they don't really track for the most part, but they'll be I just need to cut out the crap, stop eating less crap. And what is that going to unconsciously do? It's going to make you eat less calories, so you don't need to track. For example, if I eat roughly the same foods every single day, and then I'm right, I'm gaining a bit of weight, let's say for dinner, I always had kind of a chocolate bar and maybe, let's say, something else, like a hot chocolate or whatever. Bit of a random random example, but first things that popped to my head. So I just know, right, I need to cut out the chocolate bar, swap it for something lower calorie to reduce my calorie intake. Or if I'm eating like chicken rice and then having like a lot of sweet chili sauce, that adds up a couple hundred calories, or barbecue sauce, and I just know, right, I need to cut down on that. And then you can consciously just eat less calories just by manipulating maybe certain food choices, or manipulating the amount of food you have, and that's going to change your calorie intake, of course. So you don't need to obviously enter everything in MyFitnessPal just to lose weight. In other words, you can use habits, you can use structure and habits and routine to help you lose weight. Another example is if, let's say, you always have something for, let's say for breakfast you always have 3 eggs and toast, then just reduce the toast. You're going to be eating less calories. That's going to result in a calorie deficit, granted you're at maintenance beforehand. So yeah, you don't need to track certain variables, and there's ways around not tracking it. It just means there might not be as likelihood of you losing weight, and it's maybe leaving it, you're shooting in the wind a bit more, you're leaving it a wee bit more up to chance. So when it comes to training, what data should you track regarding your training? I like logbooking my lifts. I recommend logbooking your lifts as well, and this is kind of probably one of the most important things to track. Obviously there's pros and cons of it, which we'll get to, but if, let's say, you go in, you know you've done 100 for 8 on squats, you know you need to beat that the next week, or you know you need to improve your form in some shape or form. If that's a slower lowering phase, getting more depth, if that's maybe spending less time at the top, you just know to beat last week's performance, to apply progressive overload, which is the main driver of muscle growth, you need to get more than that, or improve upon that in some form. So benefits of logbooking. Logbooking basically allows you to, it's a foolproof way, if your form stays the same, that you're definitely progressing. It also allows you to look back on subsequent weeks, months of training to ensure movements aren't stale, so that you haven't plateaued certain lifts. It keeps you accountable to training super hard, whereas if you don't logbook, then it can be easy just to kind of not commit fully to your sets. And reason being is, if, let's say, you're just picking a random weight each week, then it's easy to just kind of go through the motions, whereas if you have something down written on paper, let's say it's a relatively new exercise, you've been doing it for maybe a few months, and you're like, right, my body weight's going up, and this lift hasn't progressed in the last 3 weeks. My sleep's good, everything else is good. I'm obviously not applying myself enough to get to progress. So it's kind of a foolproof way of knowing if you're putting enough effort in and if you're moving forwards in the gym. Training or having a logbook can have certain drawbacks. I don't think this applies to most individuals, but it can create like a sense of anxiety around training. What I mean by that is people put a lot of pressure on themselves. I think I get some anxiety around logbooking as well. It sounds stupid, but I'll explain why. Like, training's, for example, for myself, training's super important for myself. I equate getting stronger and performing better, and I put a lot of pressure on myself, and I put a lot of value on progressing my lifts. So if I go in the gym and I don't progress my lifts, then I've gotten better at kind of maybe managing my expectations, managing my mindset about it, but that's kind of like a loss. That's me repeat what I've done last week. That's me failed to progress that set. And it can kind of create, when training's super, super important to yourself, and you're equating that to progress, then you can kind of create some sort of anxiety running up to sets, and a bit of a negative kind of, put yourself in a negative headspace, especially when you don't manage to progress. And don't get me wrong, like, that's good. It should kind of, when you're kind of getting stronger and stronger on exercise, like a squat or an RDL, it should kind of be a bit daunting, thinking, right, what you have to do to beat last week's performance, and you should kind of have some maybe slight anxiety around it. But if it's, let's say, extremely severe, then you might not want to track that, if that makes sense. And obviously with training, this isn't so much data, but I recommend keeping like things the same, like your sets, your maybe exercise selection, etc. And that itself is somewhat data, and then you can track, right, is your physique progressing with those metrics the same? If not, you need to increase volume or decrease volume. That's not so much data you track, that's just something that I keep static, and then I can assess if it's improving or not, or if I'm improving or not, and then adjust volume accordingly if I'm not recovering. And you can obviously also track your recovery. So, and you don't need to kind of write this down. You can just do it mentally in your head. Like, are you sore going into the next session? Yes or no? And then kind of keep note on that in upcoming weeks. You could write it down somewhere. You could log it in a Google Sheet or whatever, or on a bit of paper, or your notes on your phone. But just being aware of that, and like if, let's say, for 2 or 3 weeks you don't recover before the next session, let's say your legs are sore going into the next leg day, then you know you need to either improve your recovery or do less for your leg training. And as for nutrition, so nutrition, obviously the most kind of obvious thing you could track is your calories and your protein. They're kind of the main, if you're wanting to take your diet a bit more seriously and your progress a bit more seriously, as well as obviously logbooking your lifts, tracking your calories and your macros, or sorry, calories and protein first of all, is probably the most valuable place to start, because what happens with your body weight's ultimately dependent on how much calories you consume, and we need enough protein to obviously build muscle effectively. That's what actually allows us to build muscle, having an excess of protein. So they are kind of the main variables I track when it comes to nutrition. After that, a few things you can consider is like your fruit and veg intake, your salt intake, and your water intake. And again, if let's say you follow like if it fits your macros approach with eating foods daily, then this is something you can maybe have a goal for. Or if let's say you keep things consistent, then you can obviously track how much you're having daily. And then if you're following like a meal plan approach, you just have that awareness of how much you're having of each. And also there's like salt. I track my salt intake. It can impact our hydration and our electrolyte balance, which simply means being hydrated effectively to perform at your best. And for me, these kind of small variables, these fine metrics do matter, and it's something that I care about and I think will impact my progress. So I'm willing to go, well, it's not really that much effort to be honest, just kind of weighing out how much salt you're having on your meals. But yeah, I choose to do so as well. And I also keep my water intake consistent. You could say you don't have to and you could drink to first, however, I like keeping it consistent. It just means when I go to the gym, I have no doubts at all that I have done everything in my power to ensure I'm going to perform well. I know everything's absolutely nailed because everything's tracked. Again, what's measured is managed. So if, let's say, you're just starting out, feel free to track calories and macros, or calories and protein, sorry, and then you can maybe track some other variables when you see the need to, or if you feel like you can manage it and you're being consistent with your calories and protein. So pick which ones make the most sense. And something else to say as well is if something's consistently good, you might not need to track it. What I mean by that is, if you're not wanting to absolutely maximise every single thing in the gym, you're just wanting to feel good, look after yourself, look relatively good, then you might not need to kind of track how much maybe carbs and fat you're eating. Like there might not be value in that for yourself. If you're wanting to again get that 0.1%, then you can consider doing that, but you don't need to. So think, what do you need to track for your goals, for your level of consistency and effort, and how much you're wanting to put in, and choose which ones will give the most reward. For example, if someone came to me with their nutrition and they were starting to try and track, right, I eat different foods on a daily basis, I don't hit a protein goal, and I'm going to try and start tracking my salt intake on a daily basis. And that's quite ridiculous, because if you're having different foods, you're having a different amount of salt in those foods, or sodium in those foods, and potassium, which are electrolytes that are found in salt. So maybe track something if you feel like there's value in tracking it, or you need to track it. But if you don't see value in it, then you don't maybe need to track that variable. And as I touched on, sleep something you can track as well. So there's obviously things like Apple Watches, Aura Rings, and Aura Rings what I got, what I have, sorry. I've done a review of it on my YouTube channel, so if you're interested, check it out. It measures your sleep, your readiness to train, your activity, and like I said earlier, like there's downsides to tracking certain metrics as well. For example, I used to get into the habit of every time I woke up, I looked at my sleep score. I looked at how well I slept, my duration, my sleep quality, and that created some element of stress when I was trying to go to sleep the following night. What I mean by that is, if like I know I've had like a poor sleep the last few nights, then I'll be kind of trying to go to bed and be like, right, I need a good sleep, I need to sleep well, and then that will create some sort of stress, and then I'll actually sleep poorer because I've got some stress around sleep, as backwards as that sounds. So to fix that, what I basically do is I'll only look at it once a week on my check-in, because ultimately, like, me looking at my sleep score is not going to change anything, so it's only going to have a negative effect if my sleep's obviously poor. If it's good and I see I have had a good sleep, then that might have a good effect, but I think you get the drift. So sometimes consider, like, is there any negatives around tracking? And like I said, I just look at it once a week in my check-in, and I'm like, have a look at it, and I'll be like, right, why is my sleep poorer? I think, right, what's happened the last 7 days that made my sleep poorer? I see what my average sleep is for the week, and then if there is anything that I can change or improve, I'll do so accordingly. And it also can be a sign, like, when you accumulate fatigue from training, sleep can be poorer, and certain other metrics can be skewed a bit, which can be a good tool. And obviously something very valuable to track that I didn't even touch on is your body weight. So if you're wanting to kind of gain muscle effectively, having like an appropriate rate of gain is valuable. So weighing yourself daily or every second day can be a good idea. I usually just do it daily and get my clients to do it daily. The reason being is, usually if you tell someone, right, weigh themselves Monday, Wednesday, Saturday, when it gets to like any of those days, just because you're not in the routine of doing it daily, it can sometimes make it harder to remember. So if you do it daily, then it's going to make it a bit easier. And as well as that, it will obviously tell you if you're losing weight or maintaining your weight effectively, so you can adjust your nutrition accordingly. You can also consider tracking steps. So steps is one of the main variables I'd recommend tracking, as well as obviously your nutrition, body weight, your training. They're kind of the main fundamentals to track. And as for steps, it's good to kind of have a step goal, and that just ensures if you're dieting, you're burning a minimum amount of calories, or if you're in a gaining phase, it just means your expenditure is consistent so that you gain a predictable amount on a weekly basis. And it doesn't have to be super high. I think having like 7,500 steps on a daily basis isn't a big ask. It's going to be good for your overall health and well-being, and it ensures you've got an appropriate rate of gain. So steps is something else you could track, and that I recommend kind of tracking if you want to make sure you're getting the most out of everything in the gym. There's a place to maybe drop a step goal in a gaining phase if your expenditure is already pretty consistent, but I do think there is benefit of doing some steps. And with some clients, like, if I don't think they need a step goal and I think it's hindering them, or they're struggling to stick to their training on its own, I'll not give them a step goal to track because I don't think it's worth it. Whereas if they're nailing everything else, I think they can adhere to it. I think it's going to benefit them. For example, one of my clients, like, sometimes he gets like a tight back, he works an office job, so I think a step goal is valuable for himself, just so he does a minimum amount of activity, so he's not got any tightness in his back, which can cause pain and impact his ability to do certain lifts. You can also consider your blood glucose. So your blood glucose is basically the levels of like glucose in your blood, as the name suggests, and the benefit of this is high blood glucose, typically that's what individuals have when they're diabetic or pre-diabetic, and it's good to have low blood glucose. And obviously if I track it, I can be like, right, how's it looking, how's it sitting, and then I can maybe think, right, what can I do to improve it if it is high. Things like being a bit more active, sleeping better, certain supplementation, so there's benefit of potentially tracking that. That's when you kind of prick your finger and then use like a test strip to measure what your blood sugar is. You can also measure your blood pressure, not something you need to do every day, but something that you can do now and then, just to make sure it's in a good spot. And I think everyone should measure their kind of blood pressure and maybe their resting heart rate once every now and then, just to ensure their health is in a good spot, as they're both kind of good markers to look at to see if you've got overall good health. You can also consider like stress management techniques, so like tracking things like how often you meditate or do deep breathing, or time away from your phone. If, again, that could be like, if you feel like your stress is well controlled, you don't need to track it, but if your stress is super high and you struggle with stressing, that might be something valuable to track. And again, like, what you should track is dependent on the individual and dependent on your needs. Again, if someone's got, let's say, very low stress, and why would they need to track that, or why would they need to implement that? So implement and track what's going to be valuable and appropriate for yourself, and maybe the next big rock, the next big thing that's going to make the most progress, if that makes sense, that you're going to get the largest kind of reward from, if that makes sense. And you can also obviously track things like your energy levels and anything else you feel like is necessary. And again, like, track what is appropriate for your level of commitment and your what you can adhere to long term, if that makes sense. But I hope I give you some value. Just a quick recap on kind of what I do recommend tracking, kind of like the main basics is your training, if you're progressing your lifts, and then you know if you need to rotate lifts in and out. Your body weight, if you're looking to bulk or diet or whatever, of course, doing so on a regular basis, taking the averages. I think tracking your calories and proteins is a good place to start if you are wanting to take your fitness journey a bit more seriously. And then you can consider things like steps, keeping them consistent. After that, I'd probably look to track my sleep and just being, regardless if you track your sleep, just trying to get like a good duration every night. And then you could obviously look to track any other factors or metrics, that will be appropriate for yourself and have value for yourself, if that makes sense. But hope you enjoyed the video. There, like, everything I've kind of touched on are things I always track on either a daily or a weekly basis, and I think there is some value in tracking. And if you do have any questions, just let me know, and I really appreciate everyone's support on the most recent episode, especially 137, handling the festive period. I appreciate everyone's support and kind of watching or listening to that. And be sure to let me know if you want to see any certain topics covered. Drop a comment on the YouTube video or just drop me a message on Instagram, because if you kind of tell me what episodes would be valuable for yourself, it helps me create a pod or create kind of valuable content that's going to actually help you and help the podcast grow. And as well as that, it's obviously going to benefit yourself. So I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and thank you very much for watching or listening.